Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation, PBR here, again talking about the subject of the civil magistrate. In this video, we're going to be talking again about tyranny, but this time about the Christian response to tyranny. A lot of people think that the doctrine of the civil magistrate means that because it is the ordinance of God, it can basically do no wrong, and we ought to be approving of everything any civil magistrate does because that's the realm of the civil sphere, and it's not the realm of the church or the Christian to worry about those things. And it's quite a wrong way of thinking of a total pacifism toward the civil government. In fact, it is completely the contrary to the actual Reformed tradition. And traditions are one thing, the scriptures, of course, is the final standard. But at the same time, this is a very important and difficult subject because there's so much that is confused with pacifism in the Christian life. Many people think that we need to be completely pacifistic about the way that we engage the world, to let basically the civil magistrate go by and to wait around donning white sheets, waiting for a rapture to remove us from this world, rather than seeking to establish the kingdom of Christ in all nations and, of course, Christ's crown rights over all nations. So today we're going to talk about the Magdeburg Confession of 1555. It comes from the city of Magdeburg, which was a Lutheran city. It was as a city, basically a city state of Magdeburg. It was Lutheran, and they were besieged by Roman Catholic forces. The result was that they worked out a document called the Magdeburg Confession as their explanation why they were going to resist the Roman Catholic forces that were invading and eventually storming the city walls. So there's a classic document that is written that you can look up. You can find it on the internet called the Magdeburg Confession. There are a lot of people who've written on this in the last few years with the various circumstances that have come to pass with the recent unpleasantness of various diseases going over the entire face of the earth and government responses to those things. So it's become fairly popular to read. And what we're doing actually is we're finally starting to look into our older documents and find the valuable mining of the golden ore from the scriptures that we have for these subjects. So in the Magdeburg Confession, it defines the different forms of tyranny and that there are actually different forms which require different kinds of responses. In every case, we should always be praying for the conversion or for the removal of ungodly magistrates. We should be praying for godly magistrates to do right and for the power to not go to their heads and that they would become self-divinized, rather that they would realize that they are derived authorities from God. So we can always be praying for God to remove ungodly magistrates and praying that God would, in fact, convert them and cause them to be the humble servants of Christ, which they ought to be. But in explaining the four levels of tyranny, they begin with this. So the first level of tyranny is basically the sin and vices of the civil magistrate. That if a magistrate himself is sinful and has all kinds of vice in his life, it is a form of tyranny. That magistrates are an ordinance of God. They ought to reinforce the laws of God, and that basically God is the ruler over them, and they ought to recognize his authority and ought to live for virtue and for that which is right. Now, this is very difficult for the unbelieving magistrate because they don't recognize God as God. They have a lot of power, and there's a lot of temptation to use that power in an autocratic and despotic way. But their sin being unpunished, the corruption being unpunished for their personal gain of different kinds, is a form of tyranny that does affect the society. And in those cases, you can go through the courts and you can sue out different forms of protections against the civil magistrate when that's done. But that's about the level of recourse that we have, is to go through the channels of the courts to bring about lawsuits that would effectively put those things to an end. The second level is unjust violation or of theft or of theft of property or whatever, contrary to the Constitution and contrary to the oath of the civil magistrate. So violating the oath, doing things that are not right according to the Constitution, which of course is basically an establishment of God's law, that if anything is done against the law of God, if anything is done by the magistrate that violates the oath that was taken, that becomes a form of tyranny as well. So this would be all sorts of scandals you can think of in recent years, that there are all sorts of forms of ways that both bureaucrats and elected officials alike in the West have basically violated the law of God, violated the Constitution. And again, there are legal ways to go about seeking through the lesser magistrates to establish justice with these things. The third level is forcing evil on society. Unbiblical, unjust laws being established in the land. In this case, the citizens and lesser magistrates ought to resist, and they resist in different ways. Citizens resist by way of disobeying the laws biblically. And the way that we see this in scripture is obviously the Hebrew midwives in the book of Genesis or book of Exodus. When the Hebrew midwives were told by Pharaoh to expose the children of the Hebrews, which means basically to take them out into nature, put them on a rock, and let them die out there, the Hebrew midwives didn't. They actually lied to Pharaoh and told him that the Hebrew women were vigorous in giving birth, and that the children were already born before they got there, so they had no opportunity to expose the children. And this is commended by God because it is resistance to an unjust law. So, for the sake of basically a warfare context where you are seeking to disobey the civil magistrate, we have biblical authorization to disobey unjust laws, which are forcing us to do that which is unjust. You can see this in other places in scripture as well, such as where Daniel, in Daniel chapter 6, he resists the will of King Darius, who commanded that all people would pray to only him. Of course, Daniel goes and prays on his rooftop for all to see, and prays toward Jerusalem and prays in the name of the Lord and only to the Lord. And then he's put in the lion's den. And after he survives the lion's den by God's mighty hand and outstretched arm, who sent the angel to protect him, the king looks in, peers in, and says, "Daniel, did your God save you?" And of course, Daniel says that, "O king, live forever. I was found innocent before God and before you." Meaning that in resisting the unlawful ordinance of man, he was obeying the law of God, which the king had no right in the first place to violate. So that's how citizens can resist evil, tyrannical laws that are made. The other way is by uh, the lesser magistrates basically removing those magistrates who put those laws into effect. That it is legitimate for lesser magistrates to remove tyrants who would force evil upon their own uh, nations. And of course, this is worked out in the Magdeburg Confession. You can see it there. And then the final form, the highest form of tyranny, is in the civil magistrate persecuting the church specifically. The Apostle Paul says that the grievousness of his sin before the Lord, which becomes an example of God's grace abounding to chief sinners, is that he was a persecutor of the church. As a persecutor of the church, he violated the authority of the civil magistrate and the law of God to the highest and nth degree. And so we see that the persecution of the church in Scripture is the most violent and grotesque form of evil tyranny that could possibly be performed. So not only is it persecution and a pogrom against a people, it's specifically against the church out of hatred for Christ and a rejection of his authority. So all of this is set on the foundation of saying that the authority of Christ rules over all nations. And what we have to see in all of this is that civil magistrates who make themselves out to be God actually become those brute beasts which tyrannize their people. Only through bowing the knee to Christ, like it says in Psalm 2, Psalm 72, and Psalm 22, can a magistrate find justice actually being established in their lands. This is PBR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.